Welcome to you all. Can you believe it? It's January 15th of 2022. It's not too late for me to say Happy New Year and all blessings to you. May your path rise up and may your way be light in this really critical political, social, and psychological time. My name is Linwood Sloan. Those of you who know me in the administrative ring will know me as Linwood. Those of you who know me as a change agent know that I am Lenny, so my colleagues will call me both, during the time we're spending together. I'm the executive director, and I have the privilege of being the site manager for the International Institute of Peace through Tourism's network of peace projects across the globe. Founded 25 years ago, IIPT envisioned 2,400 places of peace where we could stand together in common ground and common understanding of the joy and celebration of those things that make us different, and the consecration and dedication to those things that make us the same, our values, our mores, our ethics. Our series Live and Learn comes out of the oral tradition of our grandmothers, who when they were told something that they had lost through their folk learning, but should have remembered and could have remembered, they excelled, well, live and learn, child, live and learn. We hope that you actually say that a great deal during the course of this session. Today's session on January 15th is very special because on January 15th of 1863, the African-American citizens of Pennsylvania gathered in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, at the Bethel AME church to convene a meeting for the freemen and freedmen of America to write a response to Abraham Lincoln about the Emancipation Proclamation. It was 15 days after the proclamation had become a federal and ratified, not ratified, but became a federal document. We'll clarify that. But the proclamation did not mention the condition or the status of the freemen and the freedmen, only those of the enslaved. And there were many things that document resonated, reflected, blew up, changed the dynamic of our understanding of freedom, equality, equity, and parity, and most of all, the enjoyment of the franchise. So those men and women met at Bethel AME Church, and they sent 70 men to Washington, D.C. to present their thesis and their response. Today, in our tradition, we are bringing thought leaders together with change agents to reflect on the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation as a civil rights tool for the currency of the struggle for equity, parity, and the franchise. Our motto is to introduce you to a quartet of thought leaders and then encourage change agents to draw and sketch for you a pictogram, not really the full content of the past, but tangent and constellations of events, clusters of social actions that help you have a deeper understanding of the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation and its impact. And then to have dialogue first between the change agents and our thought leaders about currency and relevance. And lastly, open up to you with the time that we have or your questions in the chat room, which we will answer to the degree that we can in these 2 hours, or respond by you putting your email in the room. I have to thank our colleagues and friends, the Dauphin County Library System, for co-hosting this series. The Dauphin County Library will be the new home of the Thomas Chester Research Center for the Value of the Vote. The Thomas Chester Research Center, words I love, Thomas Chester, who is exemplified by the full bronze figure at the monument. Research, which enlightens us as we go forward, and center as a place to bring ideas, conversations, will be located at Front and Walnut Street in Harrisburg, just 4 blocks from the current monument. But let me get started. I'd like to introduce our guests by asking them first to tell us about the currency of their work, and then why they are drawn to this conversation and what they would like to get out of this exchange with their colleagues. What are you working on now? Why did you give up 2 hours of your Saturday? Why does it make a difference, and what would you like to take away? Well, we're going to start with the Delphic Oracle, Dr. Matt Pinsker, his program at Dickinson University and his site, House Divided, we all go to when we want to fill in the missing blocks in this information. And if you have ever been at a presentation of Matt Pinsker's, you will learn the definition of the word ensorcel. Ensorcel comes from the word sorcery. He takes history and makes it intoxicating. Matt Pinsker, welcome, sir. It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you and everyone else. I'm honored to be here.
Matt, tell us about, the bios of all of our speakers are on our website. So I won't read for you what you could read for yourself, but Matt, of all the incredible things you're doing, what is a current project right now that you'd like to share with us that you're most ecstatic about?
Well, what I wanted to talk about with you was this seminar that we've been running for high school students in the region, especially targeting low income and first generation high school students who are being invited to Dickinson in the summer to learn about the movement, the struggle for emancipation as a way to understand freedom, democracy, and self-government. This is a grant that we got from the Teagle Foundation in New York. We started it last summer. We took the students, if you, Linwood, you remember this, we took the students to the gathering at the Crossroads, and you talked to them about Francis Harper and Thomas Chester. But what we did with those students was we had them study Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and the struggle for abolition, and thinking about it as a battle in some sense within the battle, not just the fight to abolish slavery, but the arguments that sometimes erupted between friends and allies in the coalition, between moderates and radicals, over what was the best, strategy to achieve change. And that's something that I think we'll probably talk a lot about this afternoon. The fights within the movement and the struggle and the tension between Douglass and Lincoln, was incredibly revelatory. They each had their positions and they influenced each other. And ultimately, of course, they achieved something great. But it wasn't easy. And I feel like that's one of the lessons that all of us could absorb, from studying emancipation, was how hard it was, how long it took, how it wasn't the end of the story, and, how patient and persistent you have to be. If you're what you call a change agent, it doesn't come easy, and you're going to have your setbacks. And that's the lesson I try to impart to the students in this program. So a couple of your panelists are part of this program. I mean, you were our tour guide, in effect, in Harrisburg. We took the students there last summer. But Cooper Wingert and Todd Mealy were part of the faculty at this program. And next summer, we're going to have a larger cohort. We're going to have 24 students from around the region. And it's all free. It's 3 weeks on Dickinson's campus, studying Lincoln and Douglas, learning about freedom and democracy. And then at the end of it, they get full college credit. And then they get like an arsenal of support to help them as they navigate the college admissions process. So, you know, today is actually the deadline for most colleges for applications. And I've just been working with, you know, our first cohort of students to try to get them through with letters of recommendation and advice. And it's been really rewarding. And next summer, we're going to have spots for 24 students. And so I'm hopeful that the people on this call today will spread the word, you know, share the good news. The Knowledge for Freedom seminar website is up. You can Google it. It's Dickinson College House Divided Project, Knowledge for Freedom. It's right there, and the application process is open.
Yes, Matt, let me ask you this question. I was really excited that you brought your students to the monument. And I was really excited, Cooper, that I was given a finite amount of time, because it made me think about how professors and high school students have to frame their information into periods and blocks of classes and times, how succinct that you have to be. Matt, what is an X-ray? What is the condition of young people who are coming into your university classes with regard to their understanding of civics in general and citizenship in particular?
Look, if I had to characterize the emotion of the students, and I think it's also right now, frankly, the emotion of most adults, they're impatient. You know, they don't have much willingness at first to put up with, you know, resistance or offense or obstacles. You know, you have to coach them along to recognize that the lesson of the past is that it's a hard fight, and sometimes you have to endure some setbacks, and they have to appreciate the work that goes into it. And some of them, all of them understand it at some level, but some of them, it takes time for them to adjust their expectations. There's a big difference between what you want and what's real. And you have to work to move those things together. It's not easy.
And what do you learn about your own method of communicating both the structural history and the value of citizenship and the ethics of citizenship with the students who have been prepared by the group of educators that have come before you?
Well, for me, and I think Cooper and Todd would also agree, you know, our challenge in the classroom, especially in a history classroom, is to bring these civic subjects to life through the story of people. You know, that's what you did at the Crossroads. That's what you have to do to get people to appreciate how complex it is. So, you know, when I talk about Abraham Lincoln, I talk about him as somebody who is a deeply anti-slavery figure. You know, believes it to his core, has always opposed slavery, and yet feels constrained, you know, by the need to build a broad coalition to hold back, and sometimes to frustrate his allies who don't think he's committed to equality, you know, parity, as you're calling it. And then there's Douglas. You know, Douglas is radical, far more radical than Lincoln, but he also has his pragmatic side, and you can explore those moments where he has to choose how to proceed. And, you know, especially in Lincoln and Douglas's case, they met each other a couple of times. And there's one great meeting in the summer of 1863, you know, 6 months after emancipation, where they are, in effect, kind of debating what's next. And Douglas, you know, Douglas wants full equality. He wants Black soldiers and Black officers, and he wants, you know, a full-fledged campaign. And Lincoln is warning him that they have to take it in stages. And, you can see the tension between them, but it's very, it's very human.
Great. It's very human. And that's what we want to have today, as a human scale conversation. And that is also why I'm starting with having civic dialogue and engagement with the four thought leaders, so that you understand the way they think, the metaphor, simile, imagery that they draw on, the sense of poetry, passion, fact that they bring. So thank you, Matt, and I'm looking forward to more contribution as we go on. Now, I want to introduce, we're colleagues, we're buddies, and we're friends. So this is the conversation of peers. And having said that, I have to say, to use the vernacular, that I have to stop meeting Dr. Todd Allen at conferences and panels where we get about 5 minutes to talk to each other before the other has to get in the elevator and leave. We are constellations crossing the universe. This might be the longest time I get to sit down with you, Dr. Allen. And so I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Todd Allen from Messiah University.
Well,
greetings, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, my brother. I want to thank you for the invitation to participate in this conversation. But also, I just want to thank you for the work that you do to keep our history alive and relevant, so that people understand that it's a means not only to better understanding our past, but it's a guide towards our present and our future. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to greet everyone else that is on this call, on this panel. Particular shout out to my brother, Todd Mealy. I love that guy. And I look forward to learning from each of you this afternoon.
Todd, will you tell us in two parts? First, institutionally, what is your big project or your passion piece? And then as a scholar, humanist, educator, journeyman, tracker of truth, what trail are you on yourself?
I need to hire you as my hype man. I look at this. This history through at least three intersecting lenses for me. As a vice president of diversity affairs, of course, I'm looking at it in the current moment through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. How can I get people to understand not only this past, but our past in terms of race and citizenship, and what that means for us in the workplace, in my case here in the higher ed context. I also look at it, I guess, through the lens, you can say, of civil rights tourism. For the past 21 years now, I have a nonprofit called the Common Ground Project that, in partnership with the PNC Foundation, takes people from all over this country on a civil rights tour, a lot of the key sites of the movement. Because for many people, it's a history, as the Southern Poverty Law Center says, that often they know two names in four words and not that well. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and I Have a Dream, right? So we've been blessed to do that. And I think kind of then flowing out of that, then is my work when I do get a chance to put a foot in the classroom as a communication professor. And so I heard in the pre-conversation the phrase public memory come up. I think Roz said that maybe. So I'm always fascinated about how our past gets remembered, particularly on the commemorative landscape, and what are these forms of remembrance, but also sometimes forgetting do in terms of impacting our engagement as citizens.
Todd, tell me, you keynote so many times, and it's really impressive the number of occasions you get to voice your thoughts and your philosophy and your perspective. But to break down the metaphor of keynote, what is the key to what you really want us to know? And what is the note that you're trying to strike in the cacophony of sounds that we're getting about this subject right now?
Well, when I think about this history, I think about it as and these are obviously not my new phrases, but to sum it up, it is a history, as James Baldwin said, that is more beautiful, more terrible, more rich, right? It's a more complex narrative than what we tell. It's a story of ordinary people who've done extraordinary things, right? And I always tell my students, when we think about, particularly, as I'm talking about the civil rights movement, they're always intrigued by the fact that many of these people that they're hearing about were their age and sometimes younger when they got involved in the movement. And I said, you have to remember, they did not set out to have holidays in their honor or be on postage stamps or to have statues. As the late Congressman John Lewis said, that they saw something and found a way to get in the way. And if they can do that, that is something that's still a relevant lesson for us, in this current moment.
That is wonderful. Now, Matt Pinsker brought up the patience, the issue of patience of the current generation. And Todd, you deal with some 18 to 25-year-olds on a daily basis. Talk to us about how much bandwidth do they have in the two crises to load on, and I use that purposefully. A generation that has permanent blue light on their chin from their phones gleaming up. How do you see them accepting, perceiving, uploading, and responding to the message that you and your colleagues are trying to bring?
Sure. First of all, I want to be fair to the 18 to 22-year-olds. It's not just them who get distracted by these devices and other sorts of things. But the thing that I found for them and for anyone really is getting as Terrence Roberts says, an informed historical perspective, right? That sometimes we, in not knowing the past, think that everything that's happening in front of us right now is new. It might have some unique or particular elements to it, but somewhere I read that there's nothing new under the sun, right? And so in giving students or giving others this informed historical perspective, hey, I get impatient sometimes, but it's an opportunity then to say, what are these lessons in our past that are relevant and we can apply, in the present. The only thing I guess maybe that frustrates me, and again, not just with young people, but with anybody, is those people who will look back, whether we're talking about the 1950s or the 1860s, and say, well, if I were there, I would have, what I would have done, right? And you can learn a lot from memes. I saw one that said, well, whatever you're doing now is what you would have done then. If you don't know that there were, if you don't know that there are issues going on and that they're not just these isolated happenings and you're oblivious to it, guess what? You would have not known and been oblivious or come up with some kind of excuse in the past.
That's a great opportunity for me to introduce our next guest, Todd, because we hear the mumble all the time. But I personally, I wouldn't. I have to steal just a little tiny bit of time to say that I had the overwhelming privilege and opportunity to work on 12 years as a slave as the choreographer of the slave movement, the dances with enslaved people that happened in that film. And in the breaks of those young actors and dancers, Todd, that I was working with, well, who were woke up in the middle of the night and made to dance. I heard so often, I wouldn't have done it. I would have refused to wake up, you know. Yeah, well, I would have gone without my meal if that was necessary. And because I was on somebody else's clock, I couldn't say children wait, you know. I really have to. But my good friend and patient guy, Roz McPherson, does have the opportunity in communities to say children wait. You know, she does have the opportunity through civic dialogue, through civic engagement, and through the contextualization of our stories through visual literacy in museums and galleries to literally create moments, Todd, where she can pull people over and say, let's download your myths and upload the facts. So let me introduce you all, Roz McPherson from the Roz Group. Good afternoon, Roz.
Hello, and Linwood, I really appreciate that you included me in this very important work. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, because it keeps telling me to unmute my. So, and I say happy Hope Day to everybody, because whatever's going on, it's the hope that continues to propel us. So I am what one would call an intercultural strategist. And my calling is to interpret and create these opportunities for history to be shared. I'm going to ask Ashley if she would share screen to show, yes, thank you. I'm just going to give you a brief look at what I'm up to, because I thank God for the important work we do. Next slide. So the Roz Group is a 15-year-old firm, and these are among the things that we do. But pertinent to this conversation is the public engagement, because we are experts in having people give voice to their concerns. And I really, really appreciate that we get to make people talk about what's going on. We're conducting a lot of diversity analysis and training. Exhibits and historic sites is one of our areas. And many people don't realize that I've been in publishing for many years. Next slide. So I just thought I'd give you a little bit about my background, because when I think of things like Emancipation Proclamation, I've been all over the world. My roots are Louisiana, by the way. So down here with my cousins, we went out to Honorsville, Louisiana right before the pandemic, because our great uncle, who was a former enslaved person, bought 12 acres of land that has been left to us, and we have promised to keep it in the family. So you think about an enslaved person, and then every woman that you see here is really accomplished. My father was a career officer in the military, and as a result, we lived in different countries. My mom, an educator, always made sure that we were really introducing ourselves, and we didn't live on base. We lived in our host community. And I discovered years later that that was my dad's way of avoiding segregation in the military. Because listen, I was born in the 50s. My parents went to college in the 50s, and those were some interesting times. So back in the olden days, the children had to be on their mother's passport. So I appreciate that, because of the fact that my parents graduated from HBCUs, we had this international experience. But let me say, mom is from sugarcane country, rural, very, very poor. My dad was from New Orleans, but since he was orphaned at a young age, he and his brothers were sent to live out on that blacksmith shop. So these are my two aunties in the middle here. The late Dr. Maya Angelou was my godmother, and she was my Aunt Dolly's closest friends. So Aunt Dolly was the first Black professor at Wake Forest. And these two fierce women went all over the world at a time where many did not. They were fierce advocates for civil rights. And so these are the people who really shaped me. And then I am a mother of 3, with the little girl down here is now 35 and the dude is 47. So let's go to the next slide. I always think it's important to give context to what brings me to this important work. So next, I have had the honor, you can go to the next slide, of working on a number of important historic projects as the project director, leader, content person. So if any of you have been to the African American Museum in Philadelphia, this was one of our important projects. So history lives in my brain. Next. Okay, many of you have been to 6th and Market in Philadelphia, to the President's House, another incredibly important project. And had the Black community not insisted, this project would not exist, because the Park Service had not planned to tell the story of the enslaved who lived at the first presidential or executive mansion, if you will. So there's so much that came out in terms of public voice, hearing the stories of our people, having myths busted. This is really a myth buster. And being able to look at this with pride and ensure that millions of people from all over the world have an additional glimpse of our history. Next slide. And so I am especially proud of Octavius Catto. And this is an old-fashioned ballot box, but he now stands proudly on the grounds of City Hall and is really a testament to voting rights, something else that I feel is so in danger. So we've got to keep these voices active. And this young man was assassinated at the age of 31. And so what this says to me, and what I tell young people, is you're never too old, too young to be involved in civil rights. This was a young man, and I am very excited about how our youth have taken up the charge. I'm almost done here. Next slide. And this is up in Lancaster. We've been working with the folks there on the Thaddeus Stevens, Lydia Hamilton Smith historic site. Linwood, I believe, is on that board. But again, an opportunity to know so much more about the involvement of people of color in this city. Next. I just threw that in because many of you have seen that big rusty ship out there on Philadelphia by IKEA. So that is the ship that my family traveled on in 1958 when we were going to live in France. And what was sort of unique about that experience is that it was an integrated experience because, you know, it was a luxury ocean liner, but also a military transport. So some of the prejudices that we would have endured outside if we were still in Louisiana or even in New York, where we eventually settled, we did not experience that in the same way on board this ship. So the woman standing there with me, her grandfather was the naval architect who actually designed this ship, and it still holds the record for being the fastest. I think I might have 2 more. All right, so again, we do a lot of community meetings because I want to hear from people, and I want to make sure that the voices are heard, no matter how big or small the project. And that's a real responsibility that I take incredibly seriously. And next. So they asked me what I was reading, but I started off by sharing with you, these are the most important books that I, as a publisher, developed back in the early 90s when I worked for Time Life. This is a comprehensive glimpse at African American history, and Time Warner's dollars were used to produce it, which means we had the money to do a first-class representation. So all of that content lives in my head and helps me when I'm working on these historic projects to make sure some of our other truths are included in those projects. And that is a real advantage to have done this kind of work, to ensure that other folks coming up with new projects have a person who is holding the foot to the fire to ensure inclusion in history. And the next slide is where I'll stop. When they ask me what I'm reading now, I just finished reading Caste. And for all of the work I do with DEI, this was a profound look. And if I advise everybody to read that book because it gives you some context about Black history that you would have never known. Then that Amanda Gorman, that young sister is off the charts, and that poetry is so intense. I'm not even a big poetry person, but she grabbed me. And of course, anybody that has my background in history and interpretation has to, I bought 1619 Project for all my relatives for Christmas. So I will stop there, even though there are a couple of others, but this was my way of introducing you to our work, my work, and my passion and calling. It's a calling for me.
And Roz, I have to say that you have been generous in 2 decades of inviting me to the table for projects at several levels. Projects before they began, projects in construction, and projects that had missed the mark and had to be rethought, restructured, including revision of their image. So I have to ask you, as we transition to our 4th thought leader, because you're out there in the place where the community is the classroom, Roz, and where common knowledge and inculturation and oral history and passing thought and legend down, what are the 3 largest myths about the Emancipation Proclamation that you meet in the halls of the museums and the galleries and the classrooms?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all of the enslaved. I think that is a huge myth. It only freed those people who were in the states that opposed the Union. So that meant there were still a whole lot of folks left out there in northern states, etc., because there's a myth that the North was a free place when it was not necessarily. So that is a big myth. So when they used to tell us about the great emancipator, and we used to buy into that. Once I became more informed, it was like, all of the nuances in language. So that's my second thing. The nuances in language that can make you think that something is not necessarily as it is. And the other myth is, and I think this is myth has been busted, just because people were freed did not mean that they were no longer in bondage, because there were other ways of suppressing people that continue to this very day. I believe that the pandemic and the quest for social justice are intertwined. They are not 2 separate events. They were major disruptors. And as a religious person, I believe that somebody up above was trying to get our attention. But that pandemic underscored social determinants of health and all kinds of other ways that are used to continuously suppress people. So I'll leave it at that.
Now, I was talking this morning to our dear friend Ramona Risco at Comcast, and We were laughing and at the same time lamenting about now 5 decades for me of public work on diversity, and that I had a wall stacked with reports and papers and documents, and that change was not a spiral but a pendulum. And therefore there was a need for new reports that brought new words, new focus, and new vision. But I want to ask you before we transition to Todd Mealy. So you work with these cultures, and I brought that up because of the number of organizations that have talked about diverse cultures, the number of foundations that have funded reports about diverse cultures. We have myths, we have legends, and we have truths about the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War. I come from a culture where the Civil War was called the War of the Rebellion, the war between the states, the war to free the slaves, the War of Northern Aggression, Mr. Lincoln's War, and on and on. It was like a kaleidoscope, ladies and gentlemen. Whoever turned it saw a different vision and a different perspective. So Roz, before we go to Todd, what do you think folks coming through the doors of your cultural organizations need to bring into the dialogue with them to be able to enter the conversations that we are trying?
All right, that's a very good and thoughtful question. I think you need to come in prepared to accept that everything is not the way we were taught at one point. I think you need to come in prepared to understand and empathize with what it means to have been endured suppression for so many centuries. I think it's also critically important for each of us to continue self-education, because there's so much knowledge that we need to process, and we cannot afford to be asleep at the wheel. And when I say self-education, everybody's not going to sit down there and read a book like Cass. That's very intense, but there are lots of articles that we can be looking. There are lots of very important videos, and there are lots of interesting documentaries coming on television that are produced by people of color who have thoroughly researched and bring different perspectives. I think that's critically important. And I just want to add this, Linwood. It's really important that we understand that as African-American people, we come to the table with a variety of skill sets and experiences that have to be respected. So you just mentioned Ramona Risco Benson, who's actually heads up PICO's foundation. Ramona was the president of the African American Museum when we first developed that exhibit. She was in a position to give my firm an opportunity. So we have to make sure we continue to leverage our positions to give these opportunities to keep the truth telling going, even in places that may not seem like they're about Black history. We're designing the lobby of the new administration building at Children's Hospital. Totally different thing, but making sure that we bring artists of color to the table to create some of that scientific inspiration. We have to continue to thread the needle, cross-pollinate, and weave a fabric that is far more inclusive, insightful, and allows us to question and think about what the sources and context are.
Bingo, you have just described Todd Mealy. You have just described Todd Mealy. When you use words like empathy, when you talk about cross-training, when you talk about perspective of each stakeholder, contributor, when you talk about check your weapons at the door so we can begin to, you're talking about our friend, our colleague, a fine father, and a man of fellowship, Todd Mealy. I have to tell you all the story that Todd says I always tell, but I have to. I set off the first time to meet Todd Mealy after reading his 2 books about William Howard Day. We were supposed to meet at a train station, and I was looking for a distinguished elder Black man with some gray on his temples, and maybe his 3-piece suit, and it was this ball of fire, quiet, raging fire, burning off myth, seeking truth, So I really appreciate having Todd stop in his orbit and his fast-moving universe of thought that he goes through in this conversation to have this time with us. Welcome, Todd Mealy. I could go on, but I'm really glad to bring you into the circle of thought leaders and agents.
Well, sure, Lenwood. Thanks for including me. I appreciate the moniker, thought leader, but with everybody that's on your panel here, I'm just fortunate to be with everybody. You talked about connections. I was a student of Matt's. Todd, Dr. Allen, and I, we had a quite an interesting connection. 5 years ago now. He came to my classroom. So anyway, it is interesting how we all get connected. You mentioned at the beginning about, this is in a way honoring Thomas Morris Chester with what's going on in Harrisburg there. So anytime I could be connected with, the name Thomas Morris Chester, I'm fortunate. He's been part of particularly my early research when I got into this about 15 years ago. Anyway, about 30 minutes ago, you asked us, Lenwood, to speak about what we're doing right now and then why we're here. Would you still like me to address that? Okay, all right. So one of the things that I'm working on now, in addition to what Matt said about the seminar at Dickinson, is I run an equity institute. It's a research institute that provides services for educators. That's one of the things we do. We do curriculum design. We do professional development training. We write policy. We help implement policy. So we work with classroom teachers, school district leaders, department chairs, superintendents, school board members. We've compiled a team that's very, very diverse in terms of both what we look like, but also where we have our feet in the field of education. We are classroom teachers at the K-12 level. We're principals at the K-12 level. Some of us are in higher ed. Some of us are on school boards. We have people that work with school boards. We're all over the field of education. But most recently, the Institute has started to do some stuff with students. And so one of the things that we started this fall was a pipeline program to get students to come back to the schools from which they've graduated. So for instance, we have developed an early education cohort on the field of education. So we're trying to get high school students to become interested in the field of education, go get a degree, and then come back to the school district from which they graduated and become teachers there. We're also trying to focus on the health sciences with that pipeline as well. So to come back as school nurses, to come back as counselors, school counselors, and whatnot. So so we've developed that's relatively new for us. We're already working with one school district in Dauphin County. And just to mark the moment with the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday coming up, we have a summer internship, the Institute does, and this past summer we had 8 people from across the country, 8 students. These are at the college level and the graduate level that worked in our internship. And what we did is we evaluated the way that the media covered Dr. King. We took a look and compared one heavily published northern newspaper with one newspaper in the South, and created our own metric to evaluate what the coverage was like. And so if folks were living in that time period, what kind of impression they would have been given by the media. Okay, so that's some of the things we've been doing lately. Why am I here? Well, I mentioned about the Equity Institute. So, you know, Lenwood, you know me, a lot of stuff that I've been doing for the last 5-10 years, you know, has been a lot in the field of education. You know, so if there's any way that I can discuss or get all of us to discuss this intersection between emancipation and education, whether we're looking at 1863 or 1865 as a date for that, I'd like to see that as part of the story, you know, of constructing schools for free persons, and have people ask themselves, which can certainly be debated, but is, you know, were, you know, schools ever designed to operate for everyone? You know, so I guess as I close my thought here, you mentioned William Howard Day when you introduced me. You know, when he was both on the school board of Harrisburg, but then also the president of the Harrisburg City School District in 1891 and 92. I mean, he gave speeches calling public schools the people's college. And have we gotten ourselves to a point yet? And if we haven't, why? But have we gotten to our point where the school system actually operates for all of the students that are in those hallways?
And Todd, would you mention something about Chester and the library company, as we are co-hosted by the Dauphin County Library System, who will soon house the Chester Research Center. Chester's importance to this conversation also.
Yeah. So Thomas Morris Chester comes from an abolitionist family, Underground Railroad operatives. Chester was educated across the state of Pennsylvania, in Africa, taught in Liberia, came back to the United States, worked in Louisiana. You know, Ms. McPherson, I don't know if it's doctor, but no, okay. So anyway, I heard you were, you know, from Louisiana, Lenwood. You have roots in Louisiana as well. So Thomas Morris Chester spent some of his last years of his life in Louisiana, and he was down there organizing during a pretty turbulent time as well. But you know, he and his family have their footprints all over the city of Harrisburg with their abolitionist activity.
Great, and we're going to hear more about them from our colleague Rick Kearns. But let me ask you two quick questions before I introduce the change agents. The first is, you talk about equity, and we hear so much about the equity of responsibility of parents in deciding what curriculum should be taught or not taught, and the really percussive language that is being used at school board meetings in the notion of cultural and multicultural literacy. I'm beginning to turn to the question today of, what do parents need to know to make these kind of decisions? I don't ask you should they, but if the parent has now become a partner in the education and a stakeholder in the curriculum, what do they need to bring into that conversation, and where do they get that help?
Honestly, Lenwood, I mean, this could go in many different directions, this question. I'm going to start with the students. The student voices are the ones that are often left out of the conversation here, meaning if the students were showing up at board meetings, if the students were talking to the media, there would likely be talk about more inclusivity in the field of education. Meaning that you know, you have a set of parents, many are my age, with their kids in school that you know, kind of went through a school system that wasn't, as you mentioned, culturally inclusive. There wasn't much variety or representation in the curriculum. I went through my pre-service education 20 some years ago, and this wasn't anything that we discussed when I was getting my teaching degree. I stumbled upon all this really partly because of stuff that Matt taught, and when I was a student of his, and I was proactive on trying to learn about history, which then led me to think about how to teach that in a way that every student that sits in my classroom is represented in the curriculum. The truth is that we have two problems right now, or two issues that don't marry. One is that the majority of students in the country are students of color. Somewhere around 54% of all students in K through 12 schools are students of color. But yet at the same time, over 80% of the teachers are white, what we would ascribe as white. And many of those teachers, in one sense, don't know civil rights history per se, and or on the other hand, haven't been challenged to think about how to create a more inclusive curriculum. So in other words, it's new to them, or in some cases, things they just haven't even thought about. So as you have the student body diversifying, you have the teaching staff is not. And this is one of the debates that was playing out in the time period that you brought us all together to talk about today. The Civil War era, antebellum, post-emancipation and whatnot. So as the school system has diversified, the student body has diversified over the last 10, 15, 20 years. That means that there has been some talk within, the teaching population to try to create a more inclusive and representative curriculum for students. Now, since we are being more inclusive as educators, that's ruffled some feathers from population of the country. And if you are going to include stories about the civil rights or the American Indian movement or second wave feminism or the Stonewall, if you're going to start to include those stories, then the fact of the matter is we will start to talk about more stories where we're talking about America as treating groups of people as second-class citizens. And that's a history that we'd have to confront. And, we've reached a political state where, many folks would just prefer to avoid those conversations.
Yes. Thank you very much, Todd. We'll come back to this question for all of our guests in the final 10 minutes. Because of home teaching, because of school board meetings, the question about lifelong learning and informing parents and engaging them in the true understanding of civics is really important. I'm on the Senator Lindy Boggs' late wife, Senator Hale Boggs' late wife, Lindy Boggs, started in National Illiteracy Institute, which I am a board member of. 44% of working parents are functionally illiterate, and they are the parents, Dr. Allen, that you well know, that are supposed to be home teaching your kids history by distance learning. And so I will come back near the end and ask the question about what do we need to teach the teachers and what do we need to teach the parents in the community to be able to have informed citizens. But now I get to introduce to you what we call change agents. If a bell rang and we wanted to change seats, any of the change agents could become thought leaders, or any of the thought leaders could become change agents in this conversation. For the purpose of this conversation, I'm using the metaphor of the airport map that says you are here. I love those maps because you come out of your flight and you say, where the heck am I? Literally, geographically, and from a traffic point. And it says, you're right here. You're in this terminal. So we've asked 4 of us to put some historical markers or pings into this big conversation about the Emancipation Proclamation. I will begin and I will pass to Cooper Wingert, who will pass to Dr. Tonya Thames Taylor, who will pass to Rick Kearns, and then each of us will ask our guests some questions before we open to you. So my flag that I wanted to put into the conversation, that I was asked to put into the conversation, was the reminder, I will say, of those who are participating and requests for them to pass a piece of information on about the Emancipation Proclamation of the enslaved people of Washington, D.C. The Emancipation Proclamation of the enslaved people of Washington, D.C. was passed by Abraham Lincoln through executive order in August of 1862. It emancipated the some 3,500 enslaved people in the District of Columbia. But more importantly, it closed the slave markets of Washington, or closed them legally. I need to really say very quickly that the sale of enslaved people and the bartering and the changing of contracts went on until the end of the war. But that is worth Googling, because when we say, did the Emancipation Proclamation free any enslaved people, it is important for you to remember or to Google and educate yourself with the actions of 5 months before the Federal Emancipation Proclamation. The enslaved people in Washington, D.C. were set free. I stutter about set free because the owner of an enslaved person in Washington, D.C. was promised $300 from the federal government for the purchase of the enslaved people. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1862 for Washington, D.C. had two provisions that I think it's important to educate you about. The first was the reimbursement of the owner for his property or her property. The second was the offer to the enslaved person of $100 if he or she would return to Africa. Lincoln's idea was to purchase ships through federal funds and to send all emancipated enslaved people in Washington, D.C. back to Africa. It's a number that is disputed, but it was well under 1,000 or a third made choices. Many fled, and their journey, their diaspora, or their quest for freedom led them to Pennsylvania. The next thing I want you to know about that emancipation of Washington's enslaved people is it set up a dynamic with Maryland, with Kentucky, and at that time, Missouri, which were all states that did not leave the Union and therefore maintain their enslaved states. They're known as the border states. I'm going to ask my colleagues to kind of unravel that. As my favorite news person on NBC says, did I get it right? But I'll ask my guests later on, did I get that right? But I'm now going to pass to the next point in time that we wanted you to know or recall, and that is Cooper to talk about what is known as the Northern Governors Conference, or the Altoona Conference. It was in September of 1862. Cooper, good afternoon and good evening, sir.
Good afternoon. Can you all see my slide deck?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was delighted when Len would ask me to speak about the Altoona Governors Conference, which he had no way of knowing this, but it was actually related to some of my recent scholarship. And we all like to flatter ourselves by thinking that what we're researching is very relevant. But in this case, I really do think it's relevant because particularly in our current conversation and the upcoming debate in the Senate this week about voting rights, I want to talk about the Altoona Governors Conference, also about Northern state politics and the Emancipation Proclamation, and really emphasized that the struggle for citizenship and voting rights during the war among Black Northern communities occurs at multiple levels of government. It's something that Thomas Morris Chester knew. I think we're going to hear more about him tonight, but I will touch on him briefly in this presentation. So the first thing, why does this meeting happen in the first place? Well, it's really convened at the instigation of Republican governors like Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania, who in the summer of 1862 feel that the Lincoln administration is dragging its feet on the issue of emancipation, and they want to push the administration further to adopt more aggressive policies. So the dates here are crucial. Curtin formally sends out the invitation to governors throughout the North to meet in Altoona on September 14th, but the meeting does not take place until September 14th, until September 24th. And those of you who know the Civil War will know that two big things happen in between that 10-day period. The Battle of Antietam, and then Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So all of a sudden, the tenor of the meeting has changed dramatically. It's no longer about pushing the Lincoln administration to action. It's about responding to a newly announced policy. And as expected, the meeting overall affirms the Emancipation Proclamation, expresses support. And when the meeting wraps up on September 25th, a delegation of governors goes to Washington to express their support for the Lincoln administration. However, one of the notable things that they do not talk about is Black military service. Lincoln's initial proclamation doesn't mention it either, but in the period between September, when Lincoln issues the preliminary proclamation, and January 1st, 1863, when the formal Emancipation Proclamation is issued, Lincoln, one of the last things he inserts into the Emancipation Proclamation is the authorization for Black enlistment. And all of a sudden, there's a really interesting role reversal. Whereas before, the whole idea of the meeting was to push the Lincoln administration further, now the Lincoln administration finds itself out ahead of most Republican governors in the North. And those of you who are students of Civil War political history will be able to draw one of the reasons why. That's because the 1862 midterms, Republicans get a bruising in those midterm elections. Democrats make gains across the North in northern state legislatures. And now this presents a problem because Lincoln leaves initially recruitment and the raising of Black regiments up to the states. So individual governors like Curtin have to authorize Black regiments. Well, Curtin is up for re-election in October 1863, and he proves pretty reluctant to associate himself with the issue of Black enlistment. Only Rhode Island and Massachusetts really take the lead in the spring of 1863. That's why we have the Massachusetts 54th and 55th, because that's really where the only state governor, John Andrew, who is aggressively pursuing Black enlistment. So the kind of standard narrative that historians tell about this is that African Americans leapt at the chance to join the Union ranks, that they went from all over the North to Massachusetts to enlist, and that's kind of true. But also, there's a bit more pragmatism to it than that narrative suggests, and we see that in Harrisburg with T. Morris Chester. So 2 weeks after they hold this meeting on January 15th to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation, Chester presides over a second meeting at the Masonic Hall in Tanner's Alley on February 3rd. And the purpose of the meeting is in large part to respond to Massachusetts recruiters who have come to Harrisburg, trying to get African-American men from Harrisburg to come to Massachusetts and enlist in the 54th. And Chester and African Americans in Harrisburg are very concerned about state politics. They're happy with the Emancipation Proclamation. They wish it could have gone further, but generally they're happy with it. But they're concerned that with the new gains the Democrats have made in the legislature, some of the new proposals in the state legislature to ban Black migration, there was even a proposal to colonize African American residents of Pennsylvania. Chester and African Americans in this meeting spend a good couple of hours talking about these issues and the threats that are posed to them at the state level. And Chester concludes the meeting by saying that Harrisburgers will enlist, but only when the call is made for Black Pennsylvanians to fall into line. So Chester and African Americans are trying to ratchet up the pressure on Andrew Curtin and the state rather than just going to Massachusetts. Now, Chester changes his mind eventually, but they only do so quite reluctantly. He leads about 50 men up to Massachusetts in late May, early June. But I think there's a speech that they give as they send these volunteers off to Massachusetts by Reverend David Stevens, a leader in the Black community, that I think is quite revealing. And Stevens talks about how frustrated he is that Black Harrisburgers were forced up into Massachusetts because Curtin would not authorize a Black regiment. And he even goes to the point where he's despairing that Maryland, a slave state, would open a recruiting station before Pennsylvania. And I think what's important here, and it might seem a little odd that African Americans in Harrisburg are so intent on serving a state government that doesn't want them throughout most of 1863. But part of the reason is throughout the Civil War, voting is still a state matter. The right to serve on juries is still a state matter. What people at the time called political rights were still arbitrated by the states, and African Americans in Harrisburg understood that. Which is why they're so intent on serving at the state level, so they can use their military service to make claims on the state. They know that Attorney General Edward Bates, the national level, has declared African Americans are U.S. citizens, but they still want this state recognition, and they kind of get it. In a really remarkable episode, Chester, 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, forces the state to accept 2 companies of African American militia. So Chester, on the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg, desegregates the state militia for the first time and becomes, along with a Black barber named Henry Bradley, the 2 first African American officers in state history. And I think it's also important to remember that when the Grand Review happens in Harrisburg 2 years later, the pamphlets and the speeches and the newspaper articles that African Americans published to advertise and to promote the Grand Review of returning Black soldiers continually make use of the phrase citizens of Pennsylvania. Because even in 1865, this is before 14th and 15th Amendments, voting rights are determined at the state level. And they're determined, as much as they're thrilled with the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, they're determined to make those claims at the state level. So I will wrap up there, and thank you again for having me here.
And it's so interesting, Cooper, about how that meeting, the Altoona governors meeting, took place in Altoona. Would you like to just vamp a little bit about how the governors got there, where they met, what were the circumstances of their departing? And I think it's interesting.
Sure. I mean, the outcome of the meeting was in large part, the whole point of the meeting was to support emancipation. So the fact that they end up endorsing Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation isn't that much of a surprise. Now, Curtin was quite sensitive of he didn't want this to look like a cabal of radical anti-slavery governors. So he made a point of inviting David Todd, the governor of Ohio, and also Francis Pierpont, who was the governor of the restored and vindicated government of Virginia, which was basically 12 guys in Alexandria. So they did bring elements. They had the governor of Maryland was there as well. So there are some dissenting elements in that conference. The governor of Maryland, the governor of Virginia aren't as enthusiastic about the Emancipation Proclamation as many of the other governors, which is an important little bit of dissent to notice. But overall, the meeting was clearly designed to push the Lincoln administration in the direction of emancipation. They didn't expect the proclamation to come right 2 days before the meeting started. That was a surprise, but I think it was more or less a welcome surprise.
And they held that meeting in Altoona in the Pennsylvania Railroad train station. The Pennsylvania Railroad and was a very important and instrumental player in the movement of troop materials. In fact, some say it was the true target of the Confederate Army. That's for another day's conversation. But we do know that Altoona was a place that the Western governors could get to after they crossed the mountains. But it was also relatively secret. You know, the newspapers say that all governors arrived on the train They got out of the train, they went across the street to a hotel, they did their business, they got back on the train. It was before tweeting and social media, so no one knew that they were there until they were long gone. Wasn't a luxury to sneak away at that time. It's an important point. It's Lincoln counting votes to make sure that he has the people's support. We also wanted to talk about a second kind of point on our map here. We're taking this conversation about the Emancipation Proclamation, putting 4 points in. One is the freeing of enslaved people in Washington, D.C., which starts their motion towards free communities. The second is this meeting of these governors. The third is something that has long been called in religious communities Watch Night, but took on a new meaning on December 31st of 1862. And we've asked Dr. Tonya Thames Taylor if she'll speak about Watch Night 1862.
Yes, I look forward to talking about this subject matter very quickly. It's something that is a subject that is very important. I want us to look at in a second, you're going to see, I am going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. And I do want to put some things in context, and that's going to come across on one of my slides. And so one of the pieces here that is going to be coming, just a second.
We're going to go into a bit of technology and share.
Yeah, we're going to share some just some pieces here. So one of the things I want to open with before I go to my presentation, I have quite a bit of links open, and I did actually already put my bio, is that, you know, and again, we were talking about why this subject matter is so important. And this is the broadside to men of color call to arms, right? And so what happens is I like to use this piece to talk about to my students about really the strange irony that history has done and then interpretations have done. And so now when you're looking at people like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who basically changed the way that people would even look at the Civil War and look at the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then they would generate a history from that. So let me say that to be very clear, and let me state it again. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the idea of the lost cause set a discourse about the Civil War and Reconstruction that we're still dismantling today. And so oftentimes when people sort of, you know, discuss Black people, particularly in their response or, you know, to the Emancipation Proclamation, because in a second, I'm going to talk about how Douglass said he saw those words forever free and what that did for him. I want to go back to this call of men, colored men's call to arms before I get started. And so here, it's this paragraph that I sort of love here. Again, this is the broadside. And I use this again to show my students about the ironies of history. And so they say here, you know, again, you know, we must now awake, arise, and forever or be forever fallen. And so here's it says our enemies have made the country believe that we are graven cowards without soul, without manhood, without the spirits of soldiers. Shall we die with this stigma resting upon our graves? So we leave this inheritance of shame on our children. No, 1,000 times no, we will rise. But reality is when people talk about this history of, you know, particularly, you know, looking at this history of, you know, African Americans, it's always they are, you know, they were, you know, freed, as if they were like sort of like sitting around just chilling, you know, waiting for, you know, somebody to come along to help them they were just sitting around singing spirituals, you know. But that's really not the case, right? And really, when we look at the extension of Watch Night, we're looking at the extension of Black agency. Okay. And so we're looking at this agency of what was happening. How did they interpret their moment? Not how the United Daughters of the Confederacy, some Southern historians, and then later the movie Birth of a Nation would interpret how they saw their freedom. Because again, that's what we're in the shadow of, right? Again, that's what we're in the shadow of. Oftentimes we're having an informal discourse about a narrative that is really a false narrative, but that's what we engage in. So here in this piece here, I named this presentation that I'm giving, and you're going to come up across how we, got over. So just 1 second here. Okay, just 1 sec. I am going to be mindful of my time. So, and I'm going to put in some links to the what's the name. And so like this particular piece about, again, how we got over, right? And reflecting on Watch Night. So Watch Night is called also Freedom Eve, of course, it goes back to 1862 in the African-American community, where African-Americans were gathering in places they deemed safe in gratitude. They were awaiting for a time where this confirmation of the Emancipation Proclamation would become law. So it wasn't like, now you see words, if you sort of Google this, people say that Black people were just anxiously awaiting. No, I mean, again, in this presentation, hopefully you'll take away something about this. I mean, really, they were looking for confirmation. I mean, like confirmation, like, is this going to go through, right? So it's like at the stroke of midnight, they knew, hey, guess what? We will continue to do, not start to do, continue to basically having access to our freedom, right? That, they would have an access, okay, guess what? A greater access to make their freedoms. I like to bring up people like Gordon, who was a slave, who was sort of beaten, and we see his back on this thing, like, you see all these whips on his back. And what happens is that, how many times was he running to Union lines? He ran to Union lines, he got whipped and went back to Union lines. So Black people were already active in their pursuit. And so what you found with Freedom Watch Night was not just necessarily a piece where Black people were just like, again, just anxiously awaiting. No, they were like, okay, look, when this happens, we're going to make it do what it do, just like we've been doing, right? So right now, today, as for many traditions that Blacks would start, Watch Night is something that starts at like late evening and they run through the midnight hour. Watch Night continues to go on. I grabbed some pieces that you can hear. You can just Google Watch Night and you can see this is something that's very much in the African-American community. And I'm going to say it's in other communities too, but in African-American communities, it's now within the last 100 years or so have really been taken over. And I say that and I'm going to explain why, really been taken over by a lot of church communities. Right? And so therefore, when you look at sort of ads for Watch Night, what you find is that it's centered in the church, and it's where, Black people are, going on New Year, what we call New Year's Eve. And so again, they have this celebratory, celebration. I mean, the celebratory, event happen. Now, the thing about it is that many people don't know why they call it Watch Night. In the African-American community, they don't know. They just know that it's been a tradition, right? Some people know, some people don't, it's been a tradition. But I want to sort of go I'm from Mississippi. I'm from the deep South, right? I grew up in a beautiful coastal town. And really, what does Watch Night feel like? I am a grandchild of sharecroppers. So when I talk about Black people, I don't talk about them in the abstract. My grandmother, before getting married, was a maid. My grandfather was a concrete layer. My older uncles chopped cotton, as they say, right? When they were in Newton, Mississippi, before they got to the coastal area. And so Watch Night, what does it feel like, right? It feels like hope. It feels like sunshine, moons, and porches, and teas, and everything you think is right. So in this slide here, I have one. Me and my cousins, we're solving all the world's problems on a porch, because again, you got this feeling of community, this collectivity. And this piece that I have by a fellow Mississippian, her name is Lisa Kane. Watch Night feels like this piece here, this piece of art here that you see on the left, where you have this young lady, she has on tattered clothes, right? But then when she's looking at what she could be, right? And so Watch Night was about what the possibilities were, how access looked, how opportunity looked, how resilience looked. And so we know that when you sort of look at Watch Night and its level of traditions, what you found is that, it was basically from other, communities, You have that, it dates back to the 1733 and Morovia Church, and then by 1740, John Wesley had sort of picked up the practice, calling it covenant renewal services. And so what happens is these services would happen at moonlight, at the full moon. They would go out, and what the white congregations would do is that they would show God their gratitude. And then if there was some need to repent and reflect, they would do so. And these types of services took place in Philadelphia, right at old St. George's Methodist Church at 235 North 4th Street. And so what you have is that, so in the white understanding of watch night, what happens is the congregants, they were going off a scripture in Matthew that basically told them that, you didn't know when the God's time was going to come. And so therefore you're supposed to be ready. So this idea of watch night was, again, at the full moon or at the top of the year, it was basically waiting for the coming of, God to return. Right. Now, where Black folks sort of depart from that is that really it was at that very piece that we just heard this wonderful presentation about. And I'm just going to go echo or ditto, right, to what happened at Antietam, because really that's where watch night starts. What? Antietam? Wait, yeah, because at Antietam, as we just told, and again, I'm not going to, want to just to redo that piece, was that's where Lincoln issues his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And what Frederick Douglass said when he saw, particularly when you looked at those words, forever free, it was transformative. Now, I want you to remember that at the very bottom here, I got some pictures of a statue that I was very instrumental in helping get at Westchester University. And that's me on the left. That was on a day that we on the right, we dedicated the statue. And then we have Douglass on the left. We wanted to have a young Douglass, and there's a whole story behind that. But what happens is that what we're looking at is when Douglass said he saw those words, forever free, how it transformed him. And I think that through these sometimes the academic exercise, we forget again about taking what Black folks said about it themselves, how they saw and read that document, how they understood their place in that moment. And Frederick Douglass said when he saw those words, forever free, he trembles, he knows it. It's now a reality. It's coming to that. So I want to be clear here that today, when people think about watch night, they have now connected the white understanding of watch night and the Black understanding of watch night. But I want the thesis to be here is that Black people, those who were already Christian, they already had Jesus, right? So they weren't really waiting for Jesus like white folks were, again, coming from, this understanding of getting back to, never know when the Father would come. They were wanting their earthly freedom. They were wanting their legal freedom. And so when we're looking at watch night, it's a combination of culture, politics, and freedom. And they understood that, and so therefore, when you're looking at, let's take an organization like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they put the great quote unquote emancipator there because in many ways, Lincoln picks up a symbolism of that legalized freedom that they had access to. Now, what the piece is that one of the challenges in teaching American history is that, a lot of times we go, people when they teach, again, this is, again, the legacy of the lost cause, the legacy of the work, the strong, effective, not moral work, but the effective work of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, is that what happens is that we really get really confused about, again, what Black people knew about themselves at this time. So it was 4 million people who were enslaved. American slavery was American slavery was the second largest slave population in the world, second only to Russian serfdom. In 1860, right, slavery, those enslaved people were worth $3.5 billion. If you make it plain in today's dollars, it was $75 billion. So when you took American slavery, it was worth more than Americans' manufacturing and productive capacity. It was slavery, and those enslaved, that enslaved population was the single largest asset in the American economy. And so therefore, why this work about understanding, the Emancipation Proclamation beyond symbolism is because what this document does and what Watch Night manifests is that the Emancipation Proclamation was a symbolic call for Black people to continue to mobilize. And they did. And we saw it in the way that they responded to the words that's when Lincoln, as we already just told us, but I'm trying to, take out the parts that I was gonna talk about that. But beyond this piece, okay, when they were able to go and to serve, they did. And then when they were able to do the capacities that they did, they did. And so when they have this watch night, right? This watch night again is this understanding of how they had this mobilism. So right now we're getting ready to go into MLK holiday. And one of the things that MLK talked about, and I'm going to now leave this slide here, and I want to so at the very end of the one that's constantly given to us on MLK's holiday is I Have a Dream. And at the end of that speech, he says, in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, and free at last. And so if you don't go to the primary documents of how Black people actually had that language, because it's been changed over time. And so what I did was that I want to share, and I'm going to end my presentation with talking about, again, for you to get an understanding of how Black people saw areas like freedom, what freedom looked like, what mobilization looked like, what, the importance of an Abraham Lincoln's Act, right? John Hope Franklin, if you get an opportunity to, and I'm gonna send you a link, it's on the National Archives, I'm gonna put it in a piece, is that John Hope Franklin wrote a wonderful essay, and it's there at the National Archives, and he talks about how, Lincoln was signing the Emancipation, his hand was shaking, and he quotes Lincoln as saying that, no, this is the most right decision that I made. And again, and John Hope Franklin is very, fair with Lincoln. And again, how Black people would see him, because we know that John Hope Franklin's family was grounded in history and law and the like sort. And so with that said and done, this is some women here. And again, if you ever just want to go and Google it, I'm going to introduce you, if you don't know these women. It was a white cat by the name of Alan Lomax. What he did was that he went to various places and he would, collect this folk music. Later, he would be known for collecting blues. And so what happens is that these two women were former slaves in a plantation in Louisiana, in which many of them, they never traveled within 7 miles of where they were born. When he basically went to interview, what was this guy? The one, if you ever know the hot sauce guy, it's like McCormick or whatever, his last name, Mac. It's Mac Ilian. They have like a hot sauce in Louisiana. It's throughout.
Tabasco.
Yeah, tobacco sauce, right? And so what happens is that they were the ones, he interviewed these slaves on his former enslaved people, liberated slaves on this plantation. And so he had these people who sort of sung these spirituals. And so what happens is that he recorded 101 of the lyrics and the words to these women. And so here he says, there is he has the thank all, because initially what we now free at last, the original title of the song was Thank God Almighty. And then that's when the rest was free at last. And so right here, I want to play just 2 minutes of this. Just so you can get the lyric, not about a minute or so you can get how the women sing this particular song. And in the lyrics, you see, they said, Satan thought that he had me sad, but free at last. And they had an understanding not only of their economic value, and this is why it's important to teach the Emancipation Proclamation and Watch Night in a certain way, meaning that to basically go through the economics of slavery, because that's undeniable in the contribution that that Black folks had in this nation. It's undeniable, the economic contributions. If people could stop trying to propagandize social justice, right? Like we're seeing the 1776 commission. I will put it in the chat in a second. The 1776 commission report of the former president, Trump, and then also looking at the work, as Roz has pointed out, of 1619. A lot of that is going back about interpretations, but what's not interpreted is the fact that slavery was the most single economic asset in America, and Black people knew their value. That's why when Abraham Lincoln, people like to think that Black people didn't know their value. That's why Frederick Douglass said, give them the musket and things could change. They did know their value. And to basically—
I want to come back to that, but let's listen to the tune.
Oh. Okay. All right. And then here's the flyer here.
Thank God, my God is here. Oh, freedom from the happy sad. Thank God, my God is here. Look the change God is here. Thank God, my God is here. Thank God, my God is here. Oh, fearless. Thank God, my God is here. Oh, freedom that is, I am glad. Thank God, my God is here. First of all, I'm going to keep him there. Thank God, my God is here. Oh, fearless. Oh, fearless. Thank God, my God is here. Fearless. Thank God, my God is here. Oh, fearless. Oh, fearless. Thank God, my God is fearless. Thank God, my God is fearless.
Would you hold that, Tonya, and we can play out at 6 o'clock with that? That would be a great thing. I'm going to use that transition because this song is a ring shout. It is based upon the tradition of call and response. It is a circle dance where the caller goes in one circle and the responders go in another. It's worthy of a session all its own about the enculturation of African culture. It is also a song of the South. And by way of transitioning to our last presenter of the Change Agents, I asked our poet laureate, Rick Kearns, to speak about the conversations and the songs, the messages of the North on Watch Night. We know that those who were enslaved in the South were waiting for at least this federalization of their freedom, if not their actualization of freedom. But we also know that those above the Mason-Dixon line, those who were working in free communities, and those who were working in central Pennsylvania, who were part of this intellectual community working on civil rights, civil liberties, were waiting with bated breath about another advocacy, which they had been fighting since 1838, when the Constitution of Pennsylvania was changed and men of color lost the right to vote in 1838. So these actions for them were reparation actions. We know that they were waiting since 1838 when their abolitionist hall was burned down in Philadelphia. So I'd asked Rick if he would talk about that July 15th meeting and also the notion of the colored conventions and the colored convenings as freedmen and freemen and women taking their own responsibility, their own advocacy, and as Frederick Douglass said, agitate, agitate, agitate. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. And what I've been looking at recently, I'm a big fan of T. Morris Chester, and I've been writing and studying Chester off and on since 1987. And what I have been looking at, and courtesy of the assistance of Caleb Jackson, is a resolution passed by a group of African-American leaders in Harrisburg on January 15th, 1863. And it's a remarkable document. I think when we talk about agency, I think it illustrates it quite well. And I want to read just a couple sections of it very quickly. And this document was put together by a group of really remarkable men who had been deeply involved in the Underground Railroad, had been risking their lives on a regular basis, escorting enslaved people north towards Canada. And so I'd like to read the last 3 or 4 paragraphs here. This is January 15th, 1863. Resolved that if our wishes had been consulted, we would have preferred that the proclamation should have been general instead of partial. But we can only say to our brethren of the border states, be of good cheer, the day of your deliverance draweth nigh. Do not act contrary to the rules of propriety and good citizenship, for the rod of your oppressors will eventually be smitten by the omnipotence of truth. The ark of liberty will yet dwell within your borders and rest within your gates. And further down, resolved, and this is also part of the signaling in this document, that the American flag is now a true emblem of liberty. And if called upon, we feel bound as citizens to maintain its supremacy o'er land and sea against foreign foes or domestic traitors. Okay, and this I'm interpreting as being a preliminary signal about military participation. And the last 2 paragraphs resolved that we are well aware that freedom and citizenship are attended with responsibilities, and that the success or failure of the proclamation depend entirely upon ourselves, as public sentiment will be influenced for or against that righteous decree by our correct deportment and moral standing in the community. And finally, resolved that although the proclamation was not made as an act of philanthropy or as a great deed of justice due to those suffering in bonds, but simply as a war measure, still in it, we recognize the hand of God, and for it, we are constrained to say, roll forward the day when the American soil shall no more be polluted with that crime against God, American slavery. But all will be able to say, glory to God in the highest on earth, peace and goodwill to men. And this is a resolution put together by some of the leaders of the 8th Ward community of Harrisburg that we've been learning about through the Commonwealth Monument Project and the 100 Voices. And for me, it signaled to the 8th Ward community and beyond that there was cause for jubilation and gratitude, but that taken as a whole, the Emancipation Proclamation should be seen as another reason for Black men to prepare to enter the fray and to keep their eyes on what the politicians actually do as opposed to what they say. And I think I'm interpreting it, and I think other people will interpret it also, as a fairly clear-eyed assessment of where the country was, where Lincoln was in his machinations. And all of these men had worked directly or indirectly with T. Morris Chester. A couple of them had been involved in Underground Railroad activities with Chester's mother, Jane Chester. And it's well to remember here that George and Jane Chester had set up a restaurant. It was called an oyster cellar in the late 1830s that was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And Thomas Morris Chester, grew up in a revolutionary household. And each of these men, the men who drafted this document, had been working with them or with him at various times. And I think it's another testament to what many of our speakers have been saying about Black agency. And as we slowly get to know what really happened, I think we're going to encounter more evidence like this one, like this piece, that that indicate just how sophisticated and complicated these African American leaders were in their understanding of what was going on and what could happen. Okay. And among the people involved was Reverend Stevens, who we were mentioning recently. And Stevens became a military chaplain. He was one of, I think, a little over a dozen Black chaplains in the war. And he was with the 36th United States Colored Troops as they entered Richmond. And Stevens was the first pastor of African descent to preach in that Richmond church that had been, ostensibly the African church that was always controlled by white ministers. And Stevens was the first to preach from that pulpit. And another person there was John Wolfe, and Wolfe was a remarkable man who was, again, deeply involved in the Underground Railroad, was a very well-educated man. He eventually opened a bookstore when he moved to Boston. He was a teacher, and the list goes on. But I think this resolution for me is a sampler of African American thought at that moment.
And Rick, I thought I love the juxtaposition of the presentation of voices that Tonya brought us of those who were enslaved, and their faith and their hope and their passion, and this intellectual language that was used in this document. As poet laureate, would you speak a little more about the elegance of the document just as a piece of literature? And
well, it is very well written, especially it is very much in the style of 19th century prose, but it is also very much the voice of African people. I think I hear rhythms in it and alliterations that I associate with African American writers and thinkers. And going a little further, one of the things that drew me to T. Morris Chester was the quality of his writing. I mean, he was a superb journalist and essayist and speaker. And I didn't really talk about my background in this situation, but I was introduced to Chester by a friend who was also doing some other kinds of research. And here's a guy from my hometown who is a genius. He's a brilliant writer. And the further I get into his story, including some of the things that I just heard tonight, I'm just astounded by the guy. And he was not alone. Okay, there were many very, very gifted writers and speakers.
Yes.
Who
This
are
is
people.
the mythology of illiteracy that we have to work through, and the fact, particularly below the Mason-Dixon line, although I would reference Norbert Rioux, who was from New Orleans, who came up with the way to distill sugar, or any number of great educators throughout the South who were eloquent. But the myths, as Roz talks, the myth is illiteracy. The myth is waiting to be freed, as opposed to the facts, which this resolution shows, of self-empowerment and self-activation. Rick, I would love to hear you read one day the full.
Oh, I'd be happy to. I'm working on a poem about Chester, but that's going to take forever.
Well, I'd love to hear you read the full, just as we are now reading Frederick Douglass's 4th of July. I would love to hear you read sometime.
The full resolution. No, I'd be very happy to, certainly.
So here's what we're going to do in the 10 minutes officially that we have left. Each of our change agents will ask one of the thought leaders a question. I'll ask Matt a question. I will ask Cooper if he will ask Todd Allen a question. I will ask Tonya if she'll ask Roz a question. And we will ask Rick if he asks Todd Mealy a question. That'll bring us to 6 o'clock. We will make some sign-off comments. And then as we break down those who can stay, could stay and enjoy, if our thought leaders and change agents would like to ask each other questions beyond that, or if we can take some of the questions from the chat. So I just wanted to manage the time that we have left with this process. And I pose my question to Matt Pinsker. Matt, I'd like to ask you, what is the relevance of the Emancipation Proclamation as a civil rights tool or a civil rights marker? Does it still have resonance and relevance in the current challenges about race, identity, and citizenship? Where does it fall? Where should it fall? How should we use it as we move forward?
So I think emancipation should give us faith and hope. I said people needed to learn patience. What I meant by that was you need patience to be persistent, and you have to be willing to struggle. Lincoln's favorite expression in this era, during this time period, was make haste slowly. And I'll leave that with you as my admonition for the lesson from emancipation.
That's great. Cooper, would you like to ask Todd Allen a question or comment? Okay.
Sure. Could you talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation as a blueprint for civil rights advocacy today?
Sure. I just think real quickly, they say when you don't know who said something, just say Mark Twain. Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. A lot of scholars say that the moment that we are in right now, I don't know how far into it we are, really represents a third Reconstruction, right? And so as Matt just said, talking about the persistence, the patience and the persistence of freedom, in the civil rights movement, one of my favorite songs was that freedom is a constant struggle. And so we've still got in this third Reconstruction voter suppression. We hear the language of old calling it voter integrity. It was kind of like the racial integrity and purity laws, but we know a lie when we hear it. We've still got police brutality. We've still got the persistence of segregation in education and in housing. And I think we had a visual manifestation of that, of what we're up against a year ago in the form of the insurrection. And so that Emancipation Proclamation, that I love what Sister Tonya had to say about watch night, is still relevant in these moments. We are still watching, we are still waiting, we are still persistent.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tonya, would you like to ask Roz a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Brother Todd, too, for that. My question is this, right now you showed us a picture of, and I was going to ask this question anyway, but it really goes in this. You showed us a picture of Maya Angelou, who is your godmother. And so right now we're talking about beyond symbolism. So what is your reaction to Dr. Angelou being on the flip side, the tail side of a person who was a slaveholder?
Well, I think I'm more excited that she's on the coin. I think we are so fully aware of the slaveholder aspect. I've been steeped in that down at the president's house. And I also look at, when you talked about agency earlier, she and my family members like Aunt Dolly were real role models for the quest for freedom and equity. They were fierce women who were world travelers when a lot of people did not travel. So I'm not necessarily focused on who's on the backside. We've had a chance to call him out in all kinds of ways. Even with that memorial to the enslaved down at the site where he served his term of office. So I look forward to being able to celebrate more of the Black people who were invested in our own freedom. As you said, folks weren't just sitting around waiting to be free. And quite frankly, had we not asked for it, run away, strategized, we'd probably still be enslaved. So a lot of that comes from our own voices. And I believe that I want to see more symbolism, if you will, of the presence that we've had in the evolution of this country. And I thank God that it's starting to come to light in increasing ways. And we've got much work to do. When I hear things like critical race theory being banned, a new term for anti-Black history is all it is. We have to remain vigilant that these things continue to be instructed. And I really appreciated all of your points in your talk this evening. And I love that we're both children of the Deep South. Yours was cotton, my mother was sugarcane.
Yeah. My people are tobacco and rice people, by the way. You know? And Rick, would you like to ask Todd a question?
Yeah, Todd, I'm very interested in the work that you and the initiative is doing relating to educational programs. And I was wondering if you folks had interacted with any of the community colleges in Pennsylvania. As I'm an adjunct at Harrisburg Area Community College. And I'd love to find a way to make a connection with what you're doing.
No. Yes, no. We have not been involved in any community colleges in Central PA. We've worked mostly with schools, districts out of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I mean, we have worked with some in PA, but most are in New York State, Maryland, a couple states out west, but that's it.
Okay, but have you had any interaction with the Harrisburg City School District?
No, no, but we are doing something with a school district in Dauphin County, as I think I mentioned earlier, but that's not the Harrisburg School District.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, if I will, this is not related to your question, Rick, Lenwood. If I can, I just
absolutely. You four get the last say. So let's start with you.
I just wanted to really follow up on something that Matt said earlier today, and also, Todd Allen as well. One thing I'd like for folks to, if they're not familiar with this aspect of the story of emancipation and freedom, just not long after the Emancipation Proclamation, 144 leaders, Black leaders, they met in Syracuse, New York, in October of 1864 and founded the National Equal Rights League. And that was to discuss a road forward post-emancipation. And it's often something that, it was on my agenda to bring up tonight, just to make sure people, you mentioned Google, this is something people can Google and make part of their knowledge and their own story of how they reconstruct this time period in history. Because at that National Equal Rights League convention, that first one in 1864, those 144 men and women, they were discussing that slavery was still permanent in some states and quite frankly return once the war ended. They also knew that there would be issues over land, jobs, education. They understood issues about voting rights and due process. We talked about the Pennsylvania Constitution and being rewritten to disenfranchise Black men in 1838, that being rewritten in 1875 to align with the 15th Amendment. But that Equal Rights League started a movement across the country. Within a year's time, there were 12 states that had Equal Rights Leagues. Pennsylvania was the foremost of all the states. People in Harrisburg were pretty active in that. That's a major part of the story. And it led to things like the 14th, second founding of the country, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, but also enfranchising Black men with a vote in Pennsylvania and desegregating our schools as well, which happens in 1880 through a county court case, then a state statute in 1881, which is then reinforced in a state Supreme Court case in 1882. So the Equal Rights League movement. That's all.
Thank you, Todd. No, that's a lot, and everybody don't forget to Google. That's usually I'm telling folks don't Google, stop and talk to each other. But this is a moment like I'm asking for closing comments, and so Roz, would you like to make a closing comment?
Well, I would like to first say that this was a very important way to spend the MLK holiday weekend. I learned so much. These kinds of sessions inspire me to continue with the work. Sometimes I'd say, oh God, I'm tired, I'm getting up there. But I feel I still have something to bring to the table. I am very supportive of Todd Mealy's work in education because that's actually where I started my career and then became a history textbook editor. So I've been steeped in this work for many, many years. And thank you again, Linwood, for inviting me to participate. I'd like to say I'm on the business side of history, and that's how I interact with historians, etc. So thank you again. And I appreciated meeting each and every one of my colleagues on this panel.
Thank you. Todd Allen.
Sure. Again, I too want to thank everyone on this panel. I've learned a lot. I'm going to conclude not with my own words, but with the words of the late Dr. Vincent Harding that I think sum up at least how I feel about this conversation. Quote, he says, "We are citizens of a country that we still have to create. A just country, a compassionate country, a forgiving country, a multiracial country, a multi-religious country, a joyful country that cares about its children, about its elders, that cares about itself and about the world, that cares about what the earth needs as well as what individual people need." And he concludes by saying, "I am, you are, we are citizens of a country that does not yet exist, but greatly needs to exist."
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Matt Pinsker, some closing words, thoughts, quotes, benedictions.
Just thank you so much for having me. It's been an education for me. I appreciate it.
I'm going to close by reminding you of 3 songs. The first that I love to sing. The first, Tonya Thames Taylor brought to us, "How I Got Over." And one of the things I love about how I got over is my soul looks back and wonders, not my mind, not even my heart, but my soul looks back and wonders how I got over. Bert Williams said that it is no disgrace being a Black man in America. It's just so goddamn inconvenient, and so that I am wondering how we're going to get over this as I shake and quake about the news. Which brings me to that next song that I love to sing that always makes me cry, the Negro National Anthem. Sing a song full of the hope, the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. And that faith and that hope thing has been the glue for a movement. And the last is the Star-Spangled Banner, because each time it's sung, we get caught in the histrionics of the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. But it's really a rhetorical lyceum. It's a question. Does that flag still stand for the home of the land of the free and the home of the brave? It's not about the rockets. It's not about the soprano. It's about the rhetorical question. Oh, say, does that Star-Spangled Banner still stand for the land of the free and the home of the brave? I question that when I watch the news. So does it still stand? It's work for us to do. We need every one of you on the battle line, So go home and do your homework. Find out about these enabling documents that are our tools and our banners of war. Thank you to our thought leaders. Thank you to our change agents, all of you on the front line. We'll say goodbye. We'll see you again, hopefully, on February 14th. Our next Live and Learn Lyceum is on the birthday of Frederick Douglass. We will have 4 Frederick Douglass interpreters from 4 different parts of the country bring you their favorite speeches of Frederick Douglass's, and 4 scholars place those speeches into history and context of when and why they were delivered. It's a birthday party for Frederick Douglass on the 14th, Valentine's Day. Thank you all very much. God bless you till we meet again.